Listen to me very carefully. If they ask about this book, you deny everything. Do you understand?
Yeah.
You have to close it now.
Move. You're in my way. The voice was cold, sharp, and laced with the kind of impatience that expected immediate obedience. Eleanor Hayes, looking up from her hardcover book, met the icy stare of Barbara Jenkins. Barbara, dripping in gold jewelry, sneered, "This is the priority line, not the charity line. Your kind needs to learn to wait your turn." The blatant racist venom hung in the air of the crowded Atlanta airport. This was Hartsfield-Jackson, Concourse F, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. It was, by any measure, one of the most stressful places on earth. The air was thick with the exhaustion of travelers, the smell of stale coffee, and the unspoken tension of holiday travel coming to an end. It was into this tense atmosphere that Barbara Jenkins projected her own brand of authority. She wasn't an officer of the law, but she wielded her expensive Rolex, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and her sharp cream-colored pantsuit like a loaded weapon. She was a woman who navigated the world by asserting her dominance, and she saw the world in a rigid, ugly hierarchy, and in her eyes, Eleanor Hayes was at the bottom. The line was clearly marked priority, first class. Eleanor Hayes stood in it patiently, a 55-year-old woman whose only crime was her appearance. She wore a simple, dark cashmere sweater, comfortable black pants, and a pair of supportive New Balance sneakers. Around her neck was an old, hand-knitted gray scarf, a clear relic from a bygone era. She looked, to a woman like Barbara, like a person who didn't belong. This was the reason for the attack. Barbara, talking loudly on her phone about the obscene tip she was forced to leave in the lounge, had stormed up and stopped short behind Eleanor. Annoyed that this woman in sneakers was in her way, she had tapped Eleanor hard on the shoulder. When Eleanor calmly stated she was in the correct line, Barbara looked her up and down, a gaze lingering with disgust on the old scarf. That's when she made her calculation. This woman, this kind of woman, must be a mistake. A diversity hire, an affirmative action beneficiary, a charity case. Eleanor's face didn't change, but her eyes, full of a deep, ancient weariness, narrowed. "That was uncalled for, ma'am," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Barbara laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Oh, uncalled for? How cute. Just move." But Eleanor did not move. She simply turned her back to Barbara, a silent, powerful dismissal, and faced the gate again. This refusal to be moved, this quiet dignity, infuriated Barbara more than any argument could have. Barbara Jenkins, fuming in the priority line, didn't know it, but she had just sealed her own fate and the fate of the entire flight. The gate agent, a young man terrified of Barbara's escalating volume, quickly made the boarding call. "We now invite our first-class passengers to board." Barbara shoved past Eleanor, muttering, "Finally, time to get away from the riffraff. Chung-wan." "Shoot." As Eleanor Hayes walked down the narrow carpeted jet bridge, the muffled sound of the airport faded behind her. She wasn't thinking about the woman in the cream suit. She was thinking about her father in a blue-collar jumpsuit. The insult from Barbara Jenkins, riffraff, echoed briefly, but it didn't sting. It was a familiar noise, the sound of people who could only see the paint job, as her father used to say. She clutched the old, hand-knitted gray scarf around her neck. It was his. He had been a mechanic for this very airline, back when it was called something else, spending 40 years of his life with grease under his nails, ensuring other people could flee. "The paint job doesn't make it fly, Elle," he told her, his voice kind in the dusty light of their Macon garage. "The engine does. Be the engine." And she had. The other passengers, annoyed and hurried, shuffled past her, unaware that the woman they were passing was Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the founder and CEO of Hayes Dynamics. They didn't know that the revolutionary whisper-quiet H9 engines on this very 767 were her design. They didn't know that the secure satellite communication array that allowed them to have Wi-Fi at 30,000 feet was her patent. She was, quite literally, the engine. This trip, like many she took, was a personal field test. She flew commercial, often in simple, comfortable clothes, to listen to the machine as her father taught her. She needed to feel the vibrations, listen to the crew interactions, and see how the systems her company built were actually performing in the real world. She found displays of wealth tacky and distracting. Her power was in her knowledge. Her anonymity was her armor. But this trip wasn't just a field test. It was deeply personal. She pulled out her phone and reread the text from her daughter Anne. It was a picture of a half-painted nursery, a soft yellow color. Baby is kicking up a storm. Can't wait to see you. Please be safe. Eleanor smiled. She wasn't just a CEO, she was about to be a grandmother. That was the real priority, the real deadline. She wasn't just flying on a global airways plane. She was flying to her family, on a machine she had helped build, wearing her father's scarf. She was the sum of all her parts, the mechanic's daughter, the brilliant engineer, and the expectant grandmother. She put the phone away, focused. She steps onto the plane. Thomas, a young flight attendant, gives a bright, forced smile. "Welcome," he says, his eyes immediately flicking past her to the important passenger, Barbara Jenkins, who is already making demands behind her. She found her assigned seat 3A, only to find it already occupied by the source of the day's ugliness, Barbara Jenkins. The first-class cabin was bathed in the muted blue and soft white light designed to calm passengers, but it had the opposite effect on Eleanor. Barbara was fully entrenched in the window seat. Her expensive Louis Vuitton handbag was placed defiantly on the aisle seat, 3C, claiming the entire row as her personal territory. She was scrolling aggressively through her phone, pointedly ignoring the aisle and the line of passengers now forming behind Eleanor. Eleanor stopped, her simple carry-on in hand. She looked at her boarding pass, the bold print clear, 3A. Then she looked at the back of Barbara's perfectly coiffed blonde head. Taking a quiet breath, Eleanor spoke, her voice polite but clear. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Barbara didn't look up. "I'm in 3A. This is 3A. Find another seat," she snapped, her thumb continuing its angry scroll. "Ma'am," Eleanor tried again, a bit firmer. "I have the boarding pass for 3A. Perhaps yours is 3C, the aisle?" At this, Barbara finally looked up, her eyes filled with annoyance as if Eleanor were a fly. "I always sit by the window," she hissed. "I'm a Dime-In member. The airline knows this. The system clearly made a mistake. You can have the aisle." She gestured dismissively at the bag on seat 3C, implying Eleanor should be grateful to even be in the row. The confrontation now blocking the aisle drew the attention of Thomas, the young flight attendant. "Is there a problem, ladies?" he asked, his smile already strained. Barbara immediately transformed, her voice taking on a frail, victimized tone. "Oh, thank goodness," she gushed, putting a hand to her chest. "This woman is harassing me. She's insisting this is her seat. But there's clearly been a mistake, and she's holding up the whole plane." Thomas's eyes darted between the two women. He saw Barbara, in her expensive cream suit and gold jewelry, loudly proclaiming her status. Then he saw Eleanor, in her simple sweater, her old scarf, and her practical New Balance sneakers. He made a quick, biased, and disastrous calculation. He turned to Eleanor, lowering his voice in a placating, conspiratorial tone. "Ma'am, I'm sure it's just a system mix-up," he said, already siding with Barbara. "But to keep things moving and get everyone settled, would you be willing to take 4B? It's just one row back, also a window. I can make sure you're taken care of." He was asking the wrong party to move, validating the aggressor simply because she looked the part. Eleanor looks at the young man who just chose convenience over correctness. Her voice is no longer soft, but steel. "No, I am not moving to 4B. I paid for the seat. Please ask this woman to move to her assigned seat." Instead of enforcing the rules, the flight attendant, Thomas, chose to manage the victim. It was a classic and critical mistake. Thomas was completely flustered by Eleanor's firm, quiet no. He was trained for safety procedures and service, not for complex public confrontations involving bias. He was expecting the woman in the sneakers to be compliant, to be grateful for the offer of another window seat. Her refusal, her steel-eyed calm, threw him off script. He could feel his smile twitching, a thin sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. The aisle was completely blocked. Passengers further back were sighing and muttering. Barbara Jenkins, however, looked positively smug. She crossed her arms, leaning back into the window seat as if she had already won. She had an ally. "Well," Barbara shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cabin hum, "are you going to do something? This is ridiculous. I am a Diamond Medallion member. I pay this airline's salaries. I want this woman removed from the plane now." The sheer audacity of the demand, coupled with the mention of diamond status, seemed to shrink Thomas even further. He was clearly intimidated. His eyes darted around looking for support. He found it in the worst possible place. A man across the aisle who just wanted to read his paper muttered, "For God's sake, lady, just take the other seat. We all want to go home." That was all the confirmation Thomas needed. He heard support for Barbara's position. He turned his full attention back to Eleanor, his voice now a desperate, pleading whisper. "Ma'am, please," he implored, trying to be conspiratorial, as if they were partners in this problem. "Look, I can make it right. We need to close the door. I'll give you a $50 drink voucher, good for any flight, anytime. And I'll personally serve you your meal and drinks first, before anyone else. What do you say?" He was offering her a bribe. He was treating this profound moment of discrimination as a simple customer service complaint that could be smoothed over with $50. Eleanor's gaze, which had been steady, turned icy. She looked at this young man who was so clearly out of his depth and felt a deep, profound disappointment. "A drink voucher?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, slicing through his panic. "You think this is about $50? Thomas stammered, "No, ma'am, it's a gesture of goodwill." "A gesture?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice still low but now carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "You are asking me to move from a seat I paid for to appease a woman who just racially insulted me in the terminal, and you are offering me a voucher. Is that the official Global Airways policy on harassment, Thomas?" The word harassment landed like a physical blow. Thomas's face drained of all color. He recoiled as if she had slapped him. "Ma'am, I'm not, this isn't harassment," he stammered, looking around wildly. This is just a seat mix-up." "It stopped being about a seat the moment you sided with her," Eleanor says. "Get your senior flight attendant, now." When confronted, some people reflect. Others, like Barbara Jenkins, grab a bigger shovel and dig faster. Thomas, looking pale and terrified, scurried away toward the galley, his retreat a clear sign of his complete surrender. Barbara, however, misinterpreted his fear as a victory. She puffed herself up, sensing that her diamond status had successfully intimidated the crew. But she was furious that Eleanor hadn't backed down, that her bribe had been refused. Now she decided to address the entire cabin as if she were holding court. "This is unbelievable," she announced loudly, her voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. "This is what's wrong with this country. This person is holding up the entire flight, all because she won't take another perfectly good seat. It's this affirmative action nonsense. They get everything given to them. They get to cut in line and they still act entitled." The word affirmative action hung in the pressurized air, an ugly, undeniable accusation. It was no longer subtext, it was text. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. The man across the aisle who had previously supported Barbara now looked down, suddenly very interested in his shoelaces. The racism was no longer deniable. Eleanor Hayes stood in the aisle, her simple bag still on her shoulder, her hardcover book still in her hand. She didn't respond to Barbara's tirade. She didn't look at the other passengers. She simply waited, her patience a form of quiet, immovable power. A moment later, Thomas returned, followed by Maria, the senior flight attendant. Maria was in her 40s with a crisp uniform and an air of no-nonsense authority. She had zero patience for delays. What is the problem here? Her voice was sharp, cutting through Barbara's lingering insults. Thomas, visibly shaking, stammered, "Ma'am, this is Mrs. Jenkins in 3A. Her ticket, her ticket is 3C. This is Hayes? Her ticket is 3A. Mrs. Hayes won't take another seat, and Mrs. Jenkins refuses to move." Maria didn't look at either passenger. Her eyes went straight to her onboard tablet. She tapped the screen, her expression hardening. She looked up, not at Eleanor, but directly at Barbara. "Ma'am," Maria said, her voice firm, "your assigned seat is 3C. You are in this passenger seat. You need to move immediately." The system, it seemed, was finally working. But Barbara, seeing Maria was not her ally, exploded. "Don't you talk to me like that," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I've been harassed. This woman is threatening me. I want to speak to the captain. I want her arrested. I am a Diamond member." Maria didn't even blink. "Ma'am, you are the one causing the disturbance. Your status does not entitle you to another person's seat. Move to 3C, or we will be forced to deplane you." Cornered by a higher authority, Barbara's rage had nowhere to go. She turned her full, venomous fury back on the one person she saw as the source of her humiliation. Eleanor. She stood up, unbuckling her seatbelt, and got right into Eleanor's personal space. You people think you can just come in and take whatever you want. This is my spot. You don't belong here." The conflict had now reached the one person who had final authority on the aircraft, the captain. But even his authority was about to be challenged. Maria, seeing Barbara's aggressive posture, had already spoken into her handset. A moment later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Armstrong emerged. He was a man in his 50s with an authoritative ex-Air Force demeanor. His face was a mask of sheer displeasure. A captain should only be called for true emergencies, and he clearly felt this was a distraction. "What is going on here?" His voice was a low, commanding baritone. Maria stepped forward, professional and precise. "Captain, this is Mrs. Jenkins, assigned to 3C, who is currently occupying 3A. This is Mrs. Hayes, assigned to 3A. Mrs. Jenkins has refused to move, used abusive language toward the passenger, and is refusing to comply with crew instructions." The captain's eyes bored into Barbara, who, for the first time, seemed to falter. "Ma'am," Captain Armstrong said, "you are in violation of federal law. Move to your seat now, or you will be removed from this aircraft." Barbara, in a last-ditch effort, tried to play the victim. "She's unstable. She threatened me. I want the police. I am a Diamond member." Before the captain could respond, a crucial voice joined the conversation. The man across the aisle, the one who had previously told Eleanor to just move, now spoke up, his face red with embarrassment. "That's not true, Captain," the man said, his voice firm. "I saw it. This woman," he pointed directly at Barbara, "has been abusive from the start. She's been screaming about affirmative action for 10 minutes. She's the problem." The witness was the final nail. The captain nodded, his mind made up. "Maria, call the gate. Have airport police meet us. This passenger is being removed." Barbara began to wail, a truly pathetic sound. "You can't do this. My meeting, my status, this is an outrage." "You did this to yourself, ma'am," the captain said, his tone final. He then turned to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly. "Ma'am, I deeply apologize for this. Are you all right? We will have her off momentarily." It seemed for a brief second like the situation was resolved. Justice, in its simplest form, was served. Barbara Jenkins was being removed. But as two gate agents hurried onto the plane to escort her, Barbara, in a final paroxysm of hate, ripped her arm away and screamed one last thing at Eleanor. "You haven't won. You'll always just be a token. You'll never really belong. I'll have your job. You're nothing." The cabin was silent, the air thick with the echo of Barbara's final hateful word. Token. But as she was being pulled into the aisle by the two frustrated gate agents, she lunged, not at the crew but at Eleanor. She was completely unhinged. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair was coming undone, her face a mask of pure, blotchy rage. The gate agents had her by the arms, trying to propel her toward the jet bridge, but she was fighting them, twisting like a trapped animal. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked. Her eyes locked on Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor hadn't moved. She was still standing by her seat. 3A, the picture of calm, dignified patience. She was holding her hardcover book in one hand. It was this calm, this dignity that was the real offense. It was the one thing Barbara couldn't stand, the one thing she couldn't bully or buy. It was proof that Barbara had, on a fundamental level, already lost. "You did this!" Barbara screamed, her voice cracking. You bitch!" In a shocking, violent motion that no one anticipated, Barbara yanked one arm free from the gate agent's grasp. She didn't lunge for Eleanor's face. She did something almost worse, something profoundly symbolic. She slapped not Eleanor, but the hardcover book in Eleanor's hand. The book flew out of Eleanor's grasp. It didn't just fall, it flew across the aisle, hitting the bulkhead wall with a loud, sick thud. It landed face down on the carpet, its spine cracked, its pages splayed open. The entire cabin gasped as one. It was such a childish, thuggish, and disrespectful act. It was a violation of the quiet, shared space of an aircraft. It was the act of a bully who had lost all control. The man across the aisle, the one who had earlier defended Eleanor, audibly said, "Oh, my God." Captain Armstrong and Maria froze in shock. Barbara, breathing heavily, sneered at the book on the floor. "Oops," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Probably the only book you ever owned. Did you get that with food stamps?" This was it, the final, unforgivable line. It was so petty, so cruel, so absurdly racist that it sucked all the remaining air out of the cabin. This was the peak of the outrage. This was the moment the line was crossed forever. Eleanor Hayes looked at the book on the floor. She looked at the hate-filled face of Barbara Jenkins. Then slowly, with all the grace in the world, she bent down. She picked up her book. She straightened up. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked cold. She looked like a CEO who had just identified a critical, systemic failure. She looked past Barbara, directly at Captain Armstrong. "Captain," Eleanor says, her voice perfectly level, "I'm afraid this is no longer just a police matter. This flight is not taking off." The captain stared. "Ma'am, I am the captain. I decide if this flight takes off." His voice was stern, offended. He was losing control of his aircraft, and this passenger, who he had just tried to help, was now challenging his ultimate authority. Barbara Jenkins, still being held by the gate agents at the door, watched this new confrontation with a confused, spiteful curiosity. Eleanor simply held up one hand, a gesture not of aggression, but of such absolute quiet finality that it silenced the captain mid-sentence. She pulled out her simple smartphone. It wasn't the latest model. It was a practical tool. "Captain," she said, her voice still level, "your crew," she glanced at Thomas, who looked like he might faint, "is untrained in basic de-escalation and biased in their response. Your passenger," she nodded at Barbara, "committed assault and racial harassment, and you," her gaze locked on him, "believe removing one person solves the systemic rot that allowed this to happen." "Systemic rot?" The captain sputtered, his face turning red. "Ma'am, you are a passenger." Eleanor ignored him. Her phone was already ringing. It connected on the first ring. "David," she said, her tone suddenly shifting, still firm but now familiar. "It's Eleanor. I'm on Global 268 at ATL." Captain Armstrong and Maria exchanged a look. The familiarity was unnerving. "Eleanor, David," Eleanor continued, "I'm fine, boys. The flight is a problem. I'm in first on the H9 prototype engine." That phrase hit the cockpit crew like a bolt of lightning. The H9 prototype. Captain Armstrong's blood ran cold. He knew Hayes dynamics. He knew they made the H9. He looked at Eleanor, at her sneakers, her old scarf, and suddenly the name Eleanor connected. Eleanor Hayes. He felt sick. Yes, David, Eleanor said into the phone. We had an incident. A passenger was abusive, racist, and just assaulted me, and your crew failed. No, not a mechanical failure, a human one. She listened for a moment. David, I don't think this crew is fit to fly. Not tonight, not until they are retrained on the Hayes standard. The captain flinched again. The Hayes standard was the mandatory anti-discrimination and de-escalation protocol developed by Hayes Dynamics that Global Airways had paid millions to implement as part of their engine contract. It was the very protocol Thomas had just catastrophically failed. Eleanor listened again, then nodded. She lowered the phone. Eleanor looks at Captain Armstrong. The CEO of Global Airways, David Chen, and would like to speak with you, Captain. She holds out her phone. The phone was passed from the passenger to the captain, and in that simple, terrifying exchange, all power in the aircraft shifted. Captain Armstrong, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat, took the small smartphone from Eleanor's steady hand as if it were a live grenade. Barbara Jenkins, still held by the agents at the door, was finally silent. She didn't understand what was happening, but she understood the look on the captain's face. She understood power, and it had just visibly left the room and reappeared in the form of this woman she had terrorized. This is Captain Armstrong, he said, his voice, usually a commanding baritone, now thin and reedy. We, like the passengers, couldn't hear the voice of David Chen on the other end, but we saw its effect. Captain Armstrong's eyes widened. He flinched. He began saying, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I understand, sir. No, sir, I was not aware. I understand completely. I will inform her." His eyes kept flicking over to Eleanor, who was no longer paying attention to him. Her gaze had shifted. She was looking with a kind of clinical disappointment at Thomas, who was leaning against a bulkhead, visibly shaking and white as a sheet. The captain hung up. He paused for a moment, composing himself, then handed the phone back to Eleanor Hayes with a hand that trembled slightly. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice thick with mortification. I had no idea. My deepest apologies." Eleanor finally looked at him, her eyes cold. "You had no idea what, Captain?" she asked, her voice cutting through the cabin. "That a black woman in sneakers could be your most important partner? Or that your crew shouldn't let passengers assault each other and slap their property to the floor?" He had no answer. He just stared, humbled. "Mr. Chen," Eleanor continued, "has confirmed my order. This flight is grounded, effective immediately." She then looked at Thomas, who let out a small, strangled sob. "And," she said, her voice carrying, "he has mandated that this entire flight crew report to headquarters at 8 a.m. tomorrow for a full retraining on the Hayes standard." Thomas slid down the bulkhead, burying his face in his hands. I'm fired," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Oh God, I'm fired." Eleanor watched him for a beat, the man who had tried to bribe her with a $50 voucher. She turned back to the captain. "I don't want him fired," she said, just loud enough for them to hear. "I want him day due. Firing him is a waste. Training him, that's an investment." Captain Armstrong looked at Eleanor, then at the broken young man, and finally he understood. I will inform the passengers." He turned, his shoulders slumped, and picked up the aircraft's intercom microphone. The captain's voice cut through the tense cabin, not with an apology for the weather, but with an announcement that sealed one passenger's fate and shocked 200 others. Captain Armstrong stood at the front, his face like stone, holding the intercom microphone. Eleanor Hayes stood quietly in the galley, observing. Barbara Jenkins, her face pale with shock, finally realized this was no longer a game she could win. Thomas stood numbly by his jump seat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." His voice boomed over the PA system, silencing the whispers. "Due to a serious security incident involving a passenger's refusal to comply with crew instructions and a physical assault, this flight, Global 268 to Seattle, is now canceled." The cabin erupted. The groans of disbelief were immediate. Canceled? A man shouted from coach. Are you serious? I have a connection. This decision was made for the safety and security of this crew and in compliance with our corporate partners, the captain added, his eyes briefly flicking toward Eleanor. Please remain calm. We are returning to the gate. All passengers will deplane. Airport police will be boarding the aircraft to handle the passenger in question. The thud of the jet bridge reconnecting was a sound of finality. The door opened, but instead of a walk of shame for one, it became an inverted procession. The 200 other passengers, annoyed and confused, had to file out row by row from economy up through first class. And as they did, they all had to pass the scene. Barbara Jenkins, the woman in the expensive suit, now being spoken to by two uniformed Atlanta airport police officers who had just stepped aboard. The whispers changed instantly. That's her, a passenger muttered, pointing at Barbara, the one who was screaming. She got the whole flight canceled, another said, filming on her phone. My God, I heard she hit the other lady. The anger of the passengers, once directed at the delay, now focused into a palpable, silent wave of contempt directed squarely at Barbara. She visibly wilted under the hundreds of staring, judgmental eyes. This was true public humiliation. Ma'am, one of the officers said, his voice polite but firm, you need to come with us. Her fate sealed, she was led off the jet bridge, not back into the terminal, but toward a separate security door. After the last angry passenger shuffles off, Eleanor Hayes is the last one left, along with the crew. The plane is eerily silent. The engines were silent, the passengers gone. All that remained was the echo of the failure. The first-class cabin, now under the harsh full glare of the cleaning lights, felt sterile and cold. Maria, the senior flight attendant, moved silently, collecting discarded cups, her face tight with embarrassment. Eleanor Hayes, her adrenaline fading, felt a deep weariness. She was no longer a CEO. She was just a woman who wanted to see her grandchild. She sat down heavily in her original seat, 3A, finally claiming it. Captain Armstrong approached, his uniform jacket unzipped slightly. The rigid military posture was gone. He was holding his pilot's hat in his hands. Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice quiet, all the intercom bluster gone. I've been a pilot for 25 years. I've handled engine failures over the Atlantic. I've handled medical emergencies. But this, what happened today, I've never been more ashamed of my aircraft. Eleanor looked up at him. It wasn't the aircraft that failed, Captain. It was the crew. I know, he said, the admission costing him. He sat down in 3C, the seat Barbara Jenkins had occupied. And the crew is my responsibility. I saw a passenger dispute. I didn't see the depth of it. I was focused on the schedule, not the person. He paused, looking at his hat. Mr. Chen told me what you said about Thomas, about retraining, not firing. That's more generous than he deserves. He's 25, Captain, Eleanor said, her voice soft. He's the same age as my son. He made a terrible, cowardly choice, but he was scared. The system, she gestured to the empty cabin, is what taught him to be scared of her. She nodded toward the door, and dismissive of me. You can't fix a 25-year career like yours if it's broken, Captain, Eleanor said. But you can fix a 6-month-old one like Thomas's. You don't throw out a new engine because of a bad fuel mix. You flush the system and teach it how to run clean. The Hayes standard, the captain says, finally understanding. It's not just a protocol. It's a philosophy. Eleanor nods. Now you see it. The canceled flight, it was not just a line item on a report. It was a rock dropped in a pond, and the ripples were just beginning. Eleanor Hayes was finally off the plane, standing in the chaotic terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson, holding her simple carry-on. The flight board above her, once displaying on time, now showed Flight 268, canceled in stark red letters. The terminal was a mess. The 200-plus passengers from her flight were now crowding the customer service desks, their anger and exhaustion palpable as they tried to get rebooked. Her phone rang. It was the CEO, David Chen, his voice warm but deeply tired. "Eleanor, don't," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I am on a plane to Atlanta now. I'm going to be there for the 8 a.m. retraining myself. I am mortified." "Don't be mortified, David. Be better," Eleanor said, her voice firm but not unkind, as she watched a young mother trying to wrangle two crying children in the rebooking line. "This was a field test, remember? Your system failed. Now we fix it." "You're right," he sighed. "By the way, Barbara Jenkins, she's a Diamond member, or was. She's banned for life from Global Airways and all our partner airlines. The police are charging her with assault." This was the final confirmation of justice. "Good," Eleanor said simply. "Now, what about you?" he asked, his voice shifting. "My assistant is booking you on a private jet. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. We need to get you to Seattle." Eleanor looked at the long line of tired passengers, the families trying to get home for the holidays, all displaced because of one woman's hate and one crew's failure. She thought of her daughter waiting for her. Then she looked at the gate for the next flight to Seattle, also delayed but boarding. "No, David, don't send a jet." "What? Why?" he asked, incredulous. "Because," she said, "there's another flight to Seattle in an hour. It's full, but I see an opportunity for some good PR." "Tell the gate agent for that flight," Eleanor says, a small smile forming, "that Hayes Dynamics is buying every passenger on that plane a free upgrade, and I'm taking the last seat in coach." The next morning at 8 a.m. sharp, the doors to the Global Airways boardroom opened, but this wasn't a meeting. It was a reckoning. The boardroom was sterile, cold, and smelled of industrial cleaner and nervous sweat. Thomas, the young flight attendant, was the first one there. He hadn't slept. He wore a simple polo shirt, his face pale and his hands shaking as he clutched a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He sat in the front row, staring at the blank projector screen. Moments later, Captain Armstrong and Maria arrived together. They were also in civilian clothes, their usual crisp authority replaced by a deep, humbled exhaustion. They nodded grimly at Thomas and sat down. The rest of the flight crew from Flight 268, including those who had been working in economy and hadn't even witnessed the event, filed in. They looked resentful, muttering about their ruined day off. At 8:01 a.m., Mr. David Chen, the CEO, walked in. He looked severe, his eyes scanning the room. He stood at the front, flanked by a sharp-looking woman the crew didn't recognize. Eleanor Hayes was not there. "Good morning." Chen's voice was cold, all corporate warmth gone. "As you know, Flight 268 was canceled last night. This was not a mechanical issue, it was a human issue, an issue that cost this company over $500,000 in rebookings, vouchers, and operational fees, not to mention immeasurable damage to our brand." The crew, even the resentful ones, looked down. "Mrs. Eleanor Hayes," Chen continued, "is the founder of Hayes Dynamics. They are not just our engine provider, they are our single largest strategic partner. The woman who was assaulted, insulted, and racially abused on our flight was, for all intents and purposes, the woman who keeps this airline in the air." A wave of shock rippled through the room. The crew members who hadn't seen it now understood. "She had every right to demand this entire crew be fired, starting with you, Captain Armstrong. And you, Thomas." Thomas flinched, a small, involuntary movement. "She did not," Chen said, his voice sharp. "Instead, she invoked the Hayes Standard, which, as you may forget, is a binding part of our partnership contract. It states that in the event of a systemic failure in customer dignity, her team has the right to personally retrain our staff. So I'm turning this meeting over to her lead trainer. Listen, or find another job." The woman next to Chen stepped forward. "My name is Ms. Warren," she said. "We're going to start with one question. What is the difference between service and humanity?" The room was silent. After a long, agonizing moment, Thomas raised a shaking hand. Ms. Warren nodded at him. "Service," he said, his voice cracking, is giving someone what they paid for. Humanity is protecting them, even when it costs you something. Ms. Warren nodded slowly. Good. Let's start there. A new scene. Miles away, a phone vibrates. 30,000 feet over America, Eleanor Hayes finally got what she wanted, an uncomfortable seat and a quiet flight. She was in seat 28B, a middle seat in the coach cabin of the next flight to Seattle. On her right, a college student was fast asleep, his headphones on. On her left, a large man was snoring softly, his shoulder occasionally bumping hers. Her knees were cramped, and there was no space for her bag. She was, by all accounts, uncomfortable, and she had a small, genuine smile on her face. A different flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes, came by with the drink cart. "Ma'am, ginger ale, coffee?" "Just a ginger ale, thank you, dear," Eleanor said. "Tough flight, huh?" The attendant smiled, noticing how cramped Eleanor was. "You have no idea," Eleanor chuckled softly. The attendant moved on, having no idea she was speaking to the woman who had just canceled an entire 767. Eleanor Hayes was anonymous again. She pulled out her hardcover book. Its cover was slightly bent from where Barbara had slapped it to the floor. She carefully opened it and began to read, content in the noisy, crowded cabin. She didn't need the private jet. She just needed to get to Seattle. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She carefully retrieved it, shielding the screen from her neighbor. It was a text from her daughter Anne. "Landed? We're at the hospital. I think it's time." Eleanor's eyes went wide. "Oh my," she whispers. For a woman who managed billion-dollar satellite launches, this was the one arrival she couldn't control. The moment the plane touched down at SeaTac, Eleanor Hayes felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with corporate conflict. She was out of her middle seat before the seatbelt sign was fully off, apologizing to her neighbors as she grabbed her simple carry-on. She didn't wait for her bag. She ran. Her New Balance sneakers, the ones Barbara Jenkins had mocked, squeaked on the polished terminal floor as she navigated the late-night crowds. She burst out into the Seattle night. It was pouring rain, cold and sharp, but she didn't feel it. She jumped into the first available taxi, her voice breathless. "Swedish Medical Center, First Hill. As fast as you can, please." As a taxi sped through the wet, glittering city streets, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked window, Eleanor finally let out a breath. She was just a woman in a taxi, her heart pounding against her ribs. All the drama of the past 12 hours, the humiliation from Barbara, the failure of Thomas, the canceled flight, the phone call to the CEO, it all dissolved. The Hayes standard, the ban, the retraining, none of it mattered right now. It was just noise. The real priority, the one singular human need that had driven her across the country, was just minutes away. She arrived at the hospital, her hair damp from the rain, her old scarf clutched tight. She found the maternity ward, her heart pounding, and located the room number. She pushed the door open gently. Inside, bathed in the soft, warm light of a single lamp, was her daughter Anne, looking exhausted but glowing. In her arms was a tiny bundled blanket. "Mom," Anne whispered, her eyes filling with tears of joy. "You made it." Eleanor's hands were shaking. She dropped her bag by the door. "I told you I would," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. Her son-in-law David stepped aside, beaming. Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had grounded an entire flight and commanded CEOs, walked forward, her arms trembling, to hold her first grandchild. She sat down in the rocking chair, overwhelmed. She looked at the tiny, perfect, sleeping face. "Hello, little one," she cried softly, tears of pure joy tracking down her cheeks. "Grandma's here. Everything is going to be okay." This was her real victory. 1 month later, a mistake is a moment. A lesson, if learned, is a lifetime. 1 month after the incident, on a crowded Global Airways flight from Atlanta to LaGuardia, Thomas was working the economy cabin. He looked different. His uniform was just as crisp, but his demeanor had changed. The forced, brittle smile was gone, replaced by a quiet, observant professionalism. He was more present, more aware. A baby started wailing mid-flight, a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the cabin. A businessman in 12C sighed loudly, pulling off his noise-canceling headphones. "Can't she shut that thing up?" he muttered, loud enough for the young mother in 12A to hear. The mother, who was flying alone and looked utterly exhausted, turned bright red. "I'm so sorry, I'm trying," she whispered, fruitlessly trying to bounce the red-faced infant. The businessman scoffed and looked pointedly out the window. The old Thomas, the one from that day in November, would have done nothing. He would have ignored the situation, or worse, offered the businessman a sympathetic eye roll, eager to please the important passenger. The new Thomas stopped his cart. He walked past the businessman and knelt in the aisle next to the mother. "Flying with a little one is the hardest job in the world," he said, his voice kind and low, audible only to her. "You're doing great. Can I get you some water? Or maybe some warm milk for the baby?" The mother looked at him, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. "Oh, water would be... Thank you. Thank you so much." Thomas smiled, a genuine small smile. He then stood up and looked at the businessman in 12C. "And sir," he said, his voice polite but firm, "headphones are available for purchase if yours aren't working. We're all in this together." The businessman, surprised by the gentle but firm response, just nodded, slightly embarrassed, and put his headphones back on. Thomas had shown humanity, not just service. Later, after his shift, Thomas was in the crew lounge in Atlanta. He opened his locker. Taped to the inside of the door, where he saw it every day, was a handwritten note he had received by his retraining. It was on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind he now recognized. The note was short, but it had changed his life. It just said, "Thomas, one bad flight doesn't make a bad pilot. You control the weather in your cabin. Make it kind. E.H." The note dissolves to a final, peaceful scene. Justice for some is not a lesson. It is simply a locked door. On the same day that Thomas was earning his redemption, Barbara Jenkins was sitting in a sterile, beige-colored travel agency office in a suburban Atlanta strip mall. She looked older than she had a month ago. Her hair, while still blonde, was not perfectly coiffed. Her expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple and slightly wrinkled blouse. She tapped her fingers impatiently on the desk. "I don't understand," she said, her voice strained and thin. "Just try booking it again. I need to get to London for my son's graduation. It's next week." The travel agent, a young, bored-looking employee, sighed heavily. "Ma'am, I've tried Global Airways. I've tried British Airways. I've tried American, Lufthansa, Air France. I've tried everyone." "Why?" Barbara demanded, her voice rising with that familiar, imperious tone. "Is your system broken?" "My system isn't broken, ma'am," the agent said, turning the monitor to face Barbara. "Your name is. You see, Barbara Jenkins, flagged on the global no-fly list." He read from the screen, his voice flat. "It says, permanent ban, interference with crew, safety risk." Barbara stared at the screen. "But that's not fair. It was one little disagreement, a misunderstanding." The agent leaned back, clearly unsympathetic. "Ma'am, this isn't something I can fix. You're not just banned from Global, you are banned from their partner alliance, Redeem. He counts, 27 other airlines. You're flagged in every major system." Barbara's face crumpled. The reality of her actions, the assault, the racial slurs, the act of thuggery against a book, had resulted in a permanent grounding. She was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner of her own hate. She would not be seeing her son graduate. Her status, the one thing she valued, the thing she had wielded like a weapon, was now a digital scarlet letter that followed her everywhere. She had no power here. She had no voice. She was, finally, just riffraff. The camera pulls back, leaving her alone in the small, sad office, a prisoner of her own hate. In the end, there are two kinds of people: those who build walls in those who build engines. A few weeks had passed. The chaos of the Atlanta airport felt like a lifetime ago. Eleanor Hayes was in a quiet, comfortable living room in Seattle, the sound of a gentle rain tapping against the window. Her phone was off. The world of boardrooms, quarterly reports, and prototype engines was a million miles away. She was in a rocking chair wearing a simple, soft cardigan, her feet tucked under her. She was not a CEO. She was not a victim. She was a grandmother. In her arms, her newborn grandchild slept peacefully, a tiny, perfect, warm weight. She rocked the baby gently, looking out at the rain-streaked glass. She thought of her father. My father was a mechanic, she mused, clutching the old, familiar scarf she still wore. He spent his life with grease under his nails, making sure other people could fly. He always told me, "El, never judge a plane by its paint job. Judge it by the engine, by the work." That day on the plane, she thought, I met someone, Barbara, who only saw the paint job. She saw my skin, my clothes, my old scarf, and she decided I didn't belong. She spent her life building walls to keep people out. And I met someone else, Thomas, who was so scared of the paint job that he forgot his own work. He forgot to be human. We can't always control the hate people throw at us, Eleanor concluded, her gaze softening. We can control how we respond. We can build a wall in return, or we can build a better engine. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, a small, innocent new life. This, she thought, a profound sense of peace settling over her, is the better engine. This is the Hayes standard. It's not a protocol for an airline. It's a protocol for people. You teach the young ones, her mind flashing to Thomas, and now to this child, that kindness is the fuel. You protect the vulnerable. And you stand firm, always in your own worth. Not because you're a billionaire, but because you're human. She leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead, a simple, profound act of love and legacy. In the end, the chaotic events on that flight from Atlanta remind us of an eternal truth. Just as Eleanor's mechanic father taught her, the world may judge the paint job, but true worth always lies in the engine. We witnessed how one woman's quiet dignity, when pushed by prejudice, could deliver swift justice to the arrogant, and more importantly, extend profound forgiveness to the young man who faltered. It is a deep and lasting lesson that true status is found in our character, not our clothes. This story impresses upon our hearts that the deepest respect is owed to everyone long before we ever know who they are.